a small, dusty town in the heart of Texas during the late 1950s, life wasn't easy for anyone. But for Clara Bennett, it felt like the world had turned its back on her completely. At just 22 years old, she'd already been through more pain than most people could handle in a lifetime. Her parents were gone, taken by illness one after the other, and without them, she was left to fend for herself in a world that didn't seem to care about her struggles. She used to work at a diner on the edge of town, but when it shut down due to financial troubles, she lost her job and soon after, her tiny apartment. With no family to turn to and barely enough money for food, Clara found herself wandering aimlessly, carrying an old duffel bag with what little remained of her belongings. Every day felt heavier than the last. The sun burned hot overhead and the wind carried sand that stung her face as she walked down empty streets. People passed by, some giving her pitying glances, others ignoring her altogether. It was as if she'd become invisible, erased from the lives of those around her. Hunger gnawed at her stomach and exhaustion weighed on her body, but there was nowhere safe to rest. Every bench felt too public, every corner too exposed. She wanted to cry, but tears wouldn't come anymore. She'd run out of them long ago, one evening as the sky began to change colors, orange fading into deep purple. Clara decided to step into the local bar. She didn't have any money, but maybe sitting inside for a while would give her a break from the biting cold outside. The bar wasn't fancy. It smelled of stale beer and cigarette smoke, and the wooden floor creaked underfoot. Men sat hunched over their drinks, talking loudly or laughing at jokes that weren't funny. Most of them wore cowboy hats and boots, covered in dirt, their faces lined with years spent working under the scorching sun. They looked tough, rough around the edges, and not someone you'd want to cross paths with unless absolutely necessary. Clara chose a spot at the far end of the counter, hoping to blend into the shadows. She ordered a glass of water because it was all she could afford, or rather, pretend to afford. The bartender raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything, sliding the glass toward her. As she sipped slowly, trying to stretch out the moment before she'd have to leave, something caught her eye. A man walked in, tall and broad-shouldered, his presence commanding, even though he moved quietly. He wore a worn leather jacket over, a plain shirt, jeans faded from years of use, and boots that had seen better days. His hat was pulled low, shading his face, but when he tilted his head slightly, she saw piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through her. There was a sadness in his gaze, a kind of quiet pain that made her chest tighten. This man didn't belong here, not really. He stood apart from the others, leaning against the wall with a whiskey in hand, saying nothing. For reasons Clara couldn't explain, she couldn't stop looking at him. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, with dignity despite his rugged appearance. Or maybe it was the fact that, like her, he seemed to exist on the fringes, unnoticed by the chaos around him. Whatever it was, she felt drawn to him in a way she hadn't felt toward anyone in a long time. As the night wore on, the bartender approached Clara, his voice gruff. "You gotta order something if you're gonna stay," he said, tapping the counter impatiently. Panic bubbled up inside her. She didn't have any money, and she knew she couldn't argue her way out of this. Just as she opened her mouth to apologize, a deep voice cut through the noise. "She's with me." Everyone turned to look at the source of the voice, the silent man who had caught Clara's attention earlier. Without waiting for a response, he placed a few coins on the counter and nodded toward her. The bartender shrugged and walked away, leaving Clara stunned. She wanted to thank him, to ask why he'd helped her, but words failed her. Instead, she stayed quiet, clutching her glass tightly as if it might anchor her to reality. When the man finished his drink, he tipped his hat to the bartender and headed for the door. Clara hesitated for a moment, torn between staying put and following him. Something told her this might be her only chance to escape the bleakness of her current situation. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her duffel bag and stepped outside. Air was cooler now, the stars beginning to twinkle in the vast night sky. The man was already mounting his horse, a sleek black stallion that seemed as quiet and strong as its rider. When he noticed Clara standing there, He paused, his expression unreadable. For a moment she thought he might ride off without another word, leaving her exactly where she started. But then, almost imperceptibly, he gestured for her to follow. Her heart raced as she approached the horse, unsure of what to do next. I don't know how to ride," she admitted softly, her voice trembling. He didn't respond verbally. Instead, he extended a hand, waiting patiently until she finally took it. With surprising gentleness, he helped her onto the horse, positioning her securely behind him. And then, without another word, they rode off into the darkness. The journey was surreal. Clara clung to the saddle, her mind racing with questions. Who was this man? Why had he helped her? Where were they going? But the rhythmic sound of the horse's hooves against the hard ground and the cool breeze brushing against her face slowly calmed her nerves. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. Hours later, they arrived at a remote ranch nestled against rolling hills. The cabin was modest, with weathered wood walls and a chimney puffing out thin trails of smoke. The man dismounted and motioned for her to follow him inside. Hesitant but curious, Clara obeyed. Inside, the space was simple but warm. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. He handed her a blanket and pointed to a chair near the fire, his movements deliberate yet gentle. Then, without a word, he disappeared into another room, leaving her alone with her thoughts. For the first time in what felt like forever, Clara felt safe. She didn't know who this man was or why he'd taken her in, but she knew one thing for certain. Whatever lay ahead, it couldn't be worse than what she'd left behind. The next morning, Clara woke up to the soft glow of sunlight streaming through the cracks in the wooden walls. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The warmth of the blanket wrapped around her, and the faint smell of wood smoke made her feel safe, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Then it all came rushing back. The bar, the silent man on the horse, the ride through the night, and this strange little cabin tucked away in the middle of nowhere. Her heart skipped a beat as reality set in. Who was this man? Why had he brought her here? And what did he expect from her? She sat up slowly, folding the blanket neatly out of habit. The cabin was quiet except for the distant sound of birds chirping outside. A pot of coffee was already brewing over the fire, its rich aroma filling the room. Clara hesitated before standing, unsure if she should stay put or explore. But curiosity got the better of her. She tiptoed toward the window and peeked outside. The view took her breath away. Rolling hills stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with patches of wildflowers swaying gently in the breeze. In the distance, she could see horses grazing lazily in a fenced pasture. It was beautiful, a stark contrast to the gritty town she'd left behind. Her thoughts were interrupted when the door creaked open. The man walked in, his boots dusty from being outside. He carried a bucket of water in one hand and nodded toward the coffee pot without saying a word. Clara wasn't sure how to respond. "Thank you," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't reply, just set the bucket down and began tending to something near the fireplace. His silence unnerved her, but there was also something comforting about it. Words weren't necessary for him to convey kindness. It was in the way he moved, deliberate and thoughtful, like every action had purpose. Over the next few days, Clara tried to find her footing in this new environment. At first, she felt useless, like an outsider intruding on someone else's life. The man, who she later learned went by Ezra, spent most of his time outdoors, working tirelessly on the ranch. He fixed fences, fed the horses, and checked on the cattle, always moving with quiet efficiency. Clara stayed indoors, tidying up the cabin and cooking simple meals using whatever supplies she could find. It wasn't much, but it gave her a sense of purpose. One afternoon, while Ezra was busy mending a broken fence post, Clara decided to venture outside. She'd been cooped up in the cabin for days, too afraid to step out of her comfort zone. The fresh air hit her face like a warm embrace, and for the first time in weeks, she felt alive. As she wandered closer to the corral, one of the horses trotted over, its eyes curious and gentle. Clara froze, unsure of what to do. Horses had always intimidated her. They were so big, so powerful. But this one seemed different. Its coat gleamed in the sunlight, and its ears twitched playfully as it nudged her shoulder. "You can pet him." Clara nearly jumped out of her skin. She turned to see Ezra standing a few feet away, leaning against the fence. His voice was deep and gravelly, as though he hadn't used it in years. She hesitated before reaching out cautiously, letting her fingers brush against the horse's velvety nose. To her surprise, the animal didn't shy away. Instead, it leaned into her touch, snorting softly. A small smile tugged at the corners of Clara's lips. It was the first real smile she'd allowed herself in months. Ezra watched her for a moment before speaking again. "His name's Shadow," he said, nodding toward the horse. "He's got a good temperament. Thought you might like to meet him." Clara nodded, still stroking Shadow's neck. "He's beautiful," she murmured, her voice filled with awe. Ezra didn't respond right away, but after a pause he added, "You'll learn to ride soon enough." The idea both excited and terrified her. Ride? Her? The thought seemed impossible, but something in Ezra's tone told her he believed she could do it. Over the next few days, he started teaching her the basics. At first, she was clumsy, stumbling over the stirrups and gripping the saddle so tightly her knuckles turned white. But Ezra was patient, guiding her step by step. "Relax your grip," he'd say calmly whenever she tensed up. "Let the horse do the work." Slowly but surely, Clara began to improve. Riding became a kind of therapy for her, a way to escape the weight of her past. With each lesson, she grew more confident, not just in her ability to ride, but in herself. Ezra never pushed her too hard, always knowing when to stop and let her rest. And though he rarely spoke, his presence was steady and reassuring, like a rock she could lean on during the stormiest times. As the weeks passed, their bond deepened. Clara learned more about Ezra's life, piecing together fragments of his story bit by bit. One evening, as they sat by the fire sharing a meal of stew and cornbread, she mustered the courage to ask him about his past. "Why do you live out here all alone?" she asked softly, stirring her spoon absent-mindedly. Ezra didn't answer immediately. He stared into the flames, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with emotion. "Used to have a family once," he said, his words slow and measured. "A wife and a son. They're gone now." He didn't elaborate, and Clara didn't press him further. Some wounds ran too deep to talk about, and she understood that better than anyone. Despite his grief, Ezra wasn't bitter. If anything, he seemed determined to keep moving forward, even if progress came in small incremental steps. Watching him inspired Clara to do the same. She realized that healing wasn't about forgetting the pain. It was about finding ways to live alongside it, to carry it without letting it crush you. Life on the ranch wasn't easy, but it was honest work. Every sunrise brought a new challenge, whether it was fixing a leaky roof, herding cattle, or dealing with stubborn machinery. Yet there was a rhythm to it, a predictability that Clara found comforting. For the first time in years, she felt like she belonged somewhere, even if it was just a tiny corner of the world shared with a man who spoke little, but understood so much. One evening, as they sat side by side watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Clara felt a surge of gratitude. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of it. Whatever came next, she knew she wouldn't face it alone. Not anymore. As the days turned into weeks, Clara began to settle into a routine on the ranch. Life wasn't luxurious, but it was steady, a rhythm she hadn't realized she craved until now. Each morning started before the sun rose, with the sound of roosters crowing and the faint glow of dawn creeping through the cracks in the cabin walls. Ezra woke early, always moving with quiet purpose. He'd light the fire, brew coffee, and step outside to begin his work. At first, Clara stayed inside, tidying up or cooking breakfast. But as time went on, she found herself wanting to help, more, needing to contribute in some way. One chilly morning, as she watched Ezra saddle Shadow for a ride out to check on the cattle, Clara decided to speak up. "Can I come with you?" she asked hesitantly, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Ezra paused, turning to look at her. His expression didn't change much. He rarely showed surprise, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Approval? Maybe. Or maybe just curiosity about whether she could handle it. "Suit yourself," he said simply, grabbing an extra blanket from a nearby shelf. Without another word, he mounted Shadow and held out a hand to help her climb onto the horse behind him. This time she didn't hesitate. She swung her leg over the saddle and settled in, gripping the leather straps tightly. The familiar motion of riding brought back memories of their earlier lessons, but this felt different. This wasn't practice. It was real work. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Clara felt useful. The ride across the ranch was breathtaking. The land stretched endlessly, golden fields swaying gently in the breeze. In the distance, cows grazed lazily, their low moose echoing softly in the crisp air. Ezra pointed out things along the way, patches of wildflowers that grew only in certain seasons, trails carved by deer, and even the occasional hawk soaring high above them. Though he spoke sparingly, each word carried weight, as if he chose his sentences carefully. Clara listened intently, soaking in every detail. She realized how much she still had to learn, not just about ranching, but about surviving in this vast, untamed world. By the time they returned to the cabin later that afternoon, Clara was exhausted, but exhilarated. Her muscles ached from hours in the saddle, and her cheeks were flushed from the wind, but she couldn't stop smiling. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, she felt like she'd earned her keep. That night, as they sat by the fire eating stew, Ezra gave her a rare nod of approval. "You did good today," he said, his tone matter-of-fact but warm. It wasn't much, but coming from him, it meant everything. Over the next few weeks, Clara threw herself into learning everything she could about life on the ranch. She helped Ezra mend fences, haul water buckets, and feed the livestock. Every task came with its own set of challenges, but she tackled them head-on, determined not to give up. Sometimes she failed, like the time she accidentally spooked one of the horses while trying to brush it. But Ezra never scolded her. Instead, he'd show her how to do it properly, guiding her hands with his calloused ones until she got the hang of it. Through these moments, their bond deepened. Ezra may have been a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. When Clara struggled to lift a heavy beam while repairing a fence, he appeared without a sound, taking half the weight so she could finish the job. When she burned dinner one night, he didn't complain. Instead, he pulled out some canned beans and joked, well, sort of, that they made a fine meal anyway. Slowly, Clara began to see past his stoic exterior. Beneath the silence was a man who cared deeply, even if he didn't know how to express it in traditional ways. But it wasn't all hard work and long days. There were quiet moments, too. Times when they'd sit together under the stars, listening to the coyotes howl in the distance or watching lightning bugs dance in the summer air. During these moments, Clara would sometimes share pieces of her own story. She told him about growing up in a small house with her parents, how her mother used to sing her lullabies to sleep, and how her father taught her how to fish in the nearby creek. She talked about losing them, her voice breaking as she described the loneliness that followed. Ezra listened silently, his gaze fixed on the horizon, but his presence was enough. He didn't offer empty platitudes or try to fix her pain. He just let her talk, and somehow that made all the difference. In return, Ezra shared bits of his own life. Not often, but enough for Clara to piece together a picture of the man he'd once been. She learned that he'd grown up on this very ranch, helping his father tend to the land and animals. After his parents passed away, he inherited the property, pouring his heart into keeping it alive. Then came his wife and son, a chapter of his life he clearly cherished but refused to dwell on. They'd died years ago in a car accident, leaving him alone with nothing but memories and the weight of loss. Clara understood why he lived so far from town, why he kept to himself. Grief had shaped him, carving out a quiet solitude that both protected and isolated him. Despite the sadness in his past, Ezra wasn't bitter. If anything, he seemed resolved to honor their memory by living well, even if living well meant working tirelessly on a ranch miles away from anyone else. Watching him inspired Clara to do the same. She realized that healing wasn't about erasing the pain. It was about finding ways to carry it gracefully, to let it exist alongside joy, rather than overshadow it completely. One day as they worked side by side repairing a broken water pump, Clara noticed something unusual. Ezra's movements were slower than usual, his brow furrowed in concentration. When she asked if he was okay, he shrugged it off, muttering something about being tired. But later that evening, as they sat down to eat, she saw him wince as he reached for his cup of coffee. Concerned, she pressed him further. "You're hurt," she said firmly, setting aside her plate. "Let me take a look." Ezra hesitated, clearly reluctant to admit weakness, but eventually, he rolled up his sleeve, revealing a nasty gash on his forearm. It looked inflamed, the skin around it red and swollen. Clara gasped, immediately fetching the first aid kit from the cabinet. As she cleaned and bandaged the wound, Ezra sat quietly watching her with those piercing blue eyes of his. "You should have said something sooner," Clara scolded gently, though her tone was filled with concern. "This could get infected if we don't take care of it." Ezra gave a slight shrug, his usual response to anything remotely emotional. "It's fine," he muttered. But Clara shook her head, refusing to let him dismiss it. "No, it's not fine," she insisted. "You can't do everything on your own, you know. You've been helping me since I got here. Let me help you for once." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room was silent except for the crackling of the fire. Then Ezra nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to Clara. For the first time, she felt like they were truly partners, not just two people sharing space, but two people supporting each other through thick and thin. That night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Clara allowed herself to dream, not big dreams, but simple ones. Dreams of waking up every day to the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of birds chirping outside. Dreams of working alongside Ezra, building something meaningful together. Dreams of belonging somewhere, finally. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face it. Whatever came next, she knew she wouldn't have to face it alone, not anymore. As the weeks turned into months, Clara and Ezra fell into a rhythm that felt almost natural, like two pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together. The ranch became more than just a place to live. It was their sanctuary, a world they built brick by brick, sweat by sweat. Every sunrise brought new challenges, but also new opportunities to grow closer. Clara no longer felt like an outsider. She belonged here, in this quiet corner of the earth with Ezra by her side. Yet as much as things seemed peaceful on the surface, there were shadows lurking beneath it all. Shadows neither of them could ignore forever. One crisp autumn morning, everything changed. Clara was outside chopping firewood when she heard the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats approaching. She straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron, and squinted toward the horizon. A group of men rode into view, their horses kicking up clouds of dust as they neared the ranch. Something about them made her uneasy. They weren't locals. She could tell by their clothes, which were too polished for ranch work, and the way they carried themselves, arrogant and entitled. Their leader, a wiry man with sharp features and a sneer etched onto his face, dismounted first and strode toward her without hesitation. "Where's Calloway?" he demanded, his voice loud and grating. Clara froze, unsure how to respond. Before she could say anything, Ezra appeared from around the barn, his expression unreadable but his body tense. He didn't greet the men or even acknowledge them right away. Instead, he stood silently, arms crossed, waiting for them to speak. "We've come for what you owe," the leader said, spitting on the ground near Ezra's boots. "You've been dodging us long enough." Clara's heart sank. Owe? What did they mean? She glanced at Ezra, searching his face for answers, but he remained stoic, his jaw clenched tightly. The air between the two groups grew thick with tension. One of the men smirked, leaning casually against his saddle. "Come on, Calloway, we don't want to make trouble. Just pay up and we'll leave you alone." Ezra finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "I've paid my dues. You're asking for more than I agreed to." The leader laughed, a harsh mocking sound that sent chills down Clara's spine. "That's not how it works, Cowboy. Interest piles up fast, especially when you skip out on payments." He took a step closer, narrowing the gap between him and Ezra. "Now, are you going to cooperate, or do we need to remind you who's in charge?" Clara instinctively moved closer to Ezra, her chest tightening with fear. She wanted to scream at the men to leave, to tell them they had no right to barge onto their land and threaten them, but she knew better than to provoke them. These weren't ordinary men, they were dangerous, ruthless, and clearly used to getting their way. Her eyes darted to Ezra, hoping he'd have some kind of plan, but his focus remained locked on the intruders. After a long pause, Ezra nodded slightly toward the house. "Inside," he muttered under his breath, gesturing for Clara to go. She hesitated, unwilling to leave him alone with these men, but the look in his eyes told her not to argue. Reluctantly, she backed away, slipping through the door and closing it softly behind her. From the window, she watched as Ezra continued to stand his ground, refusing to back down despite being outnumbered. Once inside, Clara paced nervously, her mind racing. Who were these men? What did Ezra owe them? And why hadn't he told her about any of this before now? She felt betrayed, not because Ezra had kept secrets, but because she realized just how vulnerable they truly were. Out here in the middle of nowhere, there was no one to call for help, no neighbors to hear their cries if things turned violent. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, she felt exposed, unprotected. When the men finally left, muttering threats under their breath, Ezra came inside looking weary but unharmed. Clara wasted no time confronting him. "Who were those guys?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "What do they want from you?" Ezra sighed heavily, sinking into a chair by the table. For a moment, he stared at his hands as if debating whether to answer. Then, reluctantly, he began to explain. Years ago, desperate to save the failing ranch after his parents' deaths, he'd borrowed money from a loan shark, a man known for preying on struggling farmers and ranchers. At first, the terms had seemed manageable, but over time, the lender kept raising the amount owed, adding interest on top of interest until Ezra was trapped in a cycle he couldn't escape. No matter how hard he worked or how much he paid, the debt never seemed to shrink. "I thought I could handle it," Ezra admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But every time I paid them off, they found another excuse to keep coming back. It's extortion, plain and simple." Clara listened in stunned silence, her mind reeling. How could anyone be so cruel? How could they justify taking advantage of someone who was already struggling to survive? She wanted to scream, to cry, to lash out at the injustice of it all, but instead she forced herself to stay calm. Losing control wouldn't solve anything. "Well, you're not doing this alone anymore," she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We'll figure something out, together." Ezra shook his head, his expression grim. "This isn't your fight," he insisted. "You've done nothing wrong. Don't drag yourself into this mess." But Clara refused to back down. "It is my fight," she shot back, her voice rising slightly. "Whether you like it or not, we're in this together now. You saved me when I had nowhere else to go. Let me help you for once." For a long moment, Ezra didn't respond. He simply stared at her, his piercing blue eyes searching hers as if trying to gauge her determination. Finally, he nodded slowly, though his expression remained troubled. "All right," he said quietly. "But don't say I didn't warn you. Over the next few days, Clara and Ezra devised a plan. They couldn't afford to wait for the men to return. They needed to take action before things escalated further. Ezra revealed that he'd been keeping records of every payment he'd made, along with receipts and letters documenting the lender's illegal practices. If they could get this evidence to the sheriff, maybe they could put an end to the harassment, once and for all. The plan was risky. The loan shark had connections in town, meaning they couldn't trust anyone blindly. They'd have to gather the documents, sneak into town under the cover of darkness, and deliver the evidence directly to the sheriff's office without being caught. It wasn't foolproof, but it was their best shot. On the night they decided to act, Clara felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration coursing through her veins. As they packed the documents into a satchel and saddled Shadow, she couldn't help but think about how far she'd come since arriving at the ranch. Back then she'd been scared, hopeless, and utterly alone. Now she was standing shoulder to shoulder with Ezra, ready to face whatever came their way. "You ready?" Ezra asked, his voice soft but steady. Clara took a deep breath, nodding resolutely. "Let's do this." With that, they mounted the horse and rode off into the night, their hearts pounding but their resolve unshaken. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The journey into town felt longer than usual that night. The darkness wrapped around them like a heavy blanket, muffling the sounds of Shadow's hooves against the dirt road. Clara clung tightly to Ezra as they rode, her mind racing with every possible scenario. What if the loan shark's men were already watching the sheriff's office? What if someone tipped them off before they could deliver the evidence? Every rustle of leaves or distant howl made her jump, her nerves stretched taut like a bowstring. Ezra seemed calm, his posture steady and his grip firm on the reins. But Clara knew better. Beneath his quiet exterior, he was just as tense as she was. She could feel it in the way his shoulders were slightly stiff, the way his jaw clenched whenever they passed an unfamiliar shadow. Still, his composure gave her strength. If he could stay focused, so could she. When they finally reached the edge of town, Ezra pulled Shadow to a stop behind an old barn, hidden from view. They dismounted quietly, their movements careful and deliberate. Clara adjusted the satchel, slung over her shoulder, feeling the weight of the documents inside. These papers weren't just proof. They were their lifeline, their only chance at freedom. Losing them wasn't an option. "Stay close," Ezra whispered, his voice barely audible even in the stillness of the night. Clara nodded, her heart hammering in her chest as they crept toward the sheriff's office. The streets were eerily empty, the buildings looming like silent sentinels under the pale moonlight. Even the usual hum of crickets seemed muted, as if nature itself was holding its breath. They reached the sheriff's office without incident, slipping through the side door Ezra had scoped out earlier. Inside, the air smelled of ink and old wood, the faint ticking of a clock echoing in the small room. Ezra moved quickly, setting the satchel on the desk and spreading out the documents. Clara stood guard by the window, peering out into the street, while he worked. Her hands trembled as she gripped the curtain, scanning for any sign of movement. Just as Ezra finished organizing the papers, a noise outside caught Clara's attention. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed down the alleyway. Her stomach dropped. "Someone's coming," she hissed, turning to Ezra with wide eyes. He didn't panic. Instead, he grabbed a piece of paper and scribbled a quick note explaining everything, leaving it prominently on top of the pile. Then, grabbing Clara's arm, he ushered her toward the back exit. "We need to go. Now." They slipped out just as the front door creaked open. A figure stepped inside, silhouetted by the dim light spilling in from the street lamp outside. Clara didn't wait to see who it was. She followed Ezra, her legs moving faster than she thought possible. They ran through the narrow alleys, sticking to the shadows until they reached Shadow waiting patiently where they'd left him. Once mounted, Ezra urged the horse into a gallop, the wind whipping past them as they raced back toward the ranch. Clara held on tightly, her mind replaying the events of the night. Had they done enough? Would the sheriff believe them? And what would happen if the loan shark found out? Back at the ranch, they waited anxiously for days. jumping at every sound outside. Ezra fortified the property, setting up makeshift alarms and teaching Clara how to use a rifle. He showed her how to aim, how to steady her breathing, and most importantly, how to trust her instincts. "If they come here looking for trouble, you don't hesitate," he told her firmly. "You protect yourself in this place." Clara practiced tirelessly, determined not to let fear get the better of her. Each shot that hit the target boosted her confidence. Each miss fueled her determination to improve. Ezra watched her with a mix of pride and worry, knowing full well the danger they were facing. Yet, despite the tension hanging over them, there was a strange sense of unity between them. They were no longer just two people sharing a home. They were partners, standing together against whatever came their way. Late one evening, as they sat by the fire eating dinner, the distant rumble of engines broke the silence. Clara froze, her fork hovering mid-air. Ezra's expression darkened as he rose to his feet, grabbing his rifle. "Stay here," he ordered, heading toward the door. But Clara shook her head, rising to join him. "No, I'm not hiding anymore." For a moment, Ezra hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Together, they positioned themselves near the windows, weapons ready. The headlights of several trucks appeared on the horizon, growing brighter as they approached. 4 vehicles screeched to a halt outside the ranch, spilling out men armed with bats, chains, and guns. Their leader, the same wiry man from before, stepped forward, his sneer uglier than ever. "You shouldn't have gone to the sheriff," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "Now we're going to settle this the hard way." Clara's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. Beside her, Ezra raised his rifle, aiming steadily at the intruders. "Turn around and leave," he said, his voice cold and unwavering. "This is your last warning." The men laughed, clearly unimpressed. One of them took a step closer, brandishing a crowbar. That's when Clara acted. Remembering Ezra's lessons, she steadied her aim and fired a warning shot into the ground near the man's feet. The loud crack echoed through the night, startling everyone, including herself. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. Then chaos erupted. The intruders scattered, ducking for cover as Ezra opened fire, keeping them pinned down. Clara stayed, focused, firing another shot to keep them at bay. The adrenaline coursing through her veins drowned out her fear, sharpening her senses. She wasn't the same scared woman who'd arrived at the ranch months ago. This was her home now, and she'd fight tooth and nail to protect it. After what felt like an eternity, the attackers began retreating, shouting curses as they scrambled back into their trucks. Within minutes, they were gone, leaving behind nothing but tire tracks and shattered glass. Clara lowered her rifle, her hands trembling as the reality of what had just happened sank in. She'd faced danger head-on and survived. Ezra turned to her, his expression unreadable but his eyes shining with something close to admiration. "You did good," he said simply, placing a hand on her shoulder. It was all the praise she needed, in soy. The days that followed, news spread about the loan shark's arrest. The sheriff had acted swiftly, using the evidence Ezra and Clara provided to dismantle the operation. With the threat finally neutralized, life on the ranch returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could be after such an ordeal. As Clara stood outside one morning watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, she felt a profound sense of peace. They'd been through hell and back, but they'd come out stronger on the other side. More than anything, she realized how much she'd grown, not just as a person, but as part of something bigger than herself. Ezra joined her a few moments later, handing her a cup of coffee. Neither of them spoke, but words weren't needed. They both knew what the other was thinking. No matter what challenges lay ahead, they'd face them together. The days following the loan shark's arrest brought a sense of calm to the ranch that neither Clara nor Ezra had felt in a long time. The air seemed lighter, the sun brighter, and the weight on their shoulders finally began to lift. For Clara, it wasn't just relief. It was something deeper, a quiet confidence that she hadn't known she was capable of finding. She looked at the ranch now, not as a temporary refuge, but as a home, one she'd fought for and earned. And Ezra. He wasn't the same man who had first taken her in all those months ago. There was still sadness in his eyes, but there was also hope. a spark reignited by the bond they shared. One crisp morning, as Clara watered the garden outside the cabin, Ezra approached her with a small wooden box tucked under his arm. His expression was unreadable as always, but there was a softness in his gaze that made her curious. "What's that?" she asked, setting the watering can down. He handed her the box without a word, waiting patiently as she opened it. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet, its design simple yet elegant. Clara stared at it, then up at him, confusion flickering across her face. "It belonged to my wife," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "I want you to have it." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what to say. Accepting such a gift felt monumental, almost sacred. It wasn't just jewelry. It was a piece of his past, a symbol of trust and acceptance. Tears welled up in her eyes as she shook her head. "Ezra, I can't—" "You can," he interrupted gently, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She would have liked you. You remind me of her. Strong, kind, brave." He paused, looking away for a moment before meeting her gaze again. "This place, it hasn't felt like a home in a long time. Not until you came along." Her heart swelled with gratitude, and she nodded silently, slipping the bracelet onto her wrist. It fit perfectly, as if it had been meant for her all along. In that moment, words weren't necessary. They both understood what this gesture meant, a bridge between their painful pasts and the possibility of a brighter future together. As weeks turned into months, life on the ranch continued in its steady rhythm. But there were subtle changes, too. Clara noticed how Ezra started opening up more, sharing stories about his late wife and son. He spoke fondly of family dinners around the table, teaching his boy how to ride a horse, and dancing with his wife under the stars. These memories didn't bring tears anymore. They brought smiles. Watching him heal gave Clara courage to confront her own grief. She began writing letters to her parents, even though she knew they'd never read them. Pouring her thoughts onto paper helped her process the loss, turning sorrow into gratitude for the love they'd given her. Together, they worked on improving the ranch. Clara suggested planting a vegetable garden, which soon became a source of fresh produce for their meals. Ezra taught her how to mend fences properly, and in return, she showed him new recipes she'd learned from her mother. Their partnership evolved naturally, each day bringing them closer. They laughed more often now, finding joy in the little things, a perfectly ripe tomato plucked from the vine, the sight of Shadow galloping freely in the pasture, or the sound of rain tapping against the roof. One evening, as they sat side by side on the porch watching the sunset, Clara broke the comfortable silence. "Do you ever think about starting over?" she asked softly, her fingers tracing the edge of the bracelet on her wrist. Ezra glanced at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, building something new here. Something bigger than just us." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Maybe taking in someone else who needs help, like I did when I first came here. Or maybe even starting a family someday." Ezra didn't respond immediately. He turned his attention back to the horizon, where streaks of orange and purple painted the sky. After a long pause, he nodded slowly. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted, "but I never thought I'd find anyone willing to stick around long enough to make it happen." Clara smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Well, I'm not going anywhere." Spring arrived, bringing with it new beginnings. The wildflowers bloomed in vibrant colors, and the fields turned lush and green. One afternoon, while checking on the cattle, Clara spotted a figure walking along the edge of the property. At first, she thought it might be a traveler passing through, but as the person drew closer, she realized it was a young girl, no older than 12. Her clothes were worn and her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes held a glimmer of determination. Clara called out to her, surprised when the girl stopped and looked up cautiously. "Are you lost?" Clara asked, approaching her slowly so as not to startle her. The girl shook her head but didn't speak. Instead, she clutched a tattered backpack tightly to her chest, her knuckles white. Clara knelt down to her level, offering a reassuring smile. "It's okay. You're safe here." When Ezra joined them a few minutes later, the girl flinched at first, clearly wary of strangers. But Ezra's calm demeanor put her at ease. Over time, they learned her story. She'd run away from an abusive foster home and had been wandering aimlessly until she stumbled upon their ranch. Clara and Ezra exchanged a glance, silently agreeing that they couldn't turn her away. They offered her food, cleaned her up, and let her stay in the spare room. Slowly, the girl began to open up, revealing a sharp wit and a fierce resilience beneath her shy exterior. Clara saw glimpses of herself in the girl, the same fear, the same longing for safety and belonging. And Ezra? He saw a second chance, to be the father he'd lost so many years ago. Life on the ranch took on a new dimension with the girl's arrival. They named her Lily, after the flowers that grew abundantly near the creek. Together, the three of them formed a makeshift family, bound not by blood but by shared experiences and mutual support. Clara taught Lily how to cook, while Ezra showed her how to care for the animals. On weekends, they'd take long rides across the land, laughing as Shadow playfully chased after butterflies. For Clara, it was everything she'd dreamed of, a home filled with laughter, love, and purpose. For Ezra, it was redemption, proof that life could bloom again even in the harshest conditions. And for Lily, it was salvation, a place where she could finally feel safe. Years later, as Clara stood on the porch watching Lily chase after Shadow in the golden light of dusk, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The ranch had become more than just a sanctuary. It was a testament to resilience, to the power of human connection, and to the belief that no matter how dark things got, there was always hope. Ezra joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You did good," he said simply, his voice warm with pride. Clara leaned into him, smiling. "We did good." And under the wide-open Texas sky, surrounded by rolling hills and endless possibilities, they embraced a future built on love, trust, and the promise of tomorrow.